October 14th, 2001, 11:47 p.m. The night in western Michigan was cold enough that the air itself seemed brittle, each breath leaving pale clouds that dissolved into the darkness. A fog had rolled in from the nearby lake, low and heavy, swallowing the small two-lane road that cut through the sleeping town. Streetlights glowed dim behind the mist, their halos fading only a few feet before being consumed. It was the kind of night where sound carried strangely, boots crunching against frosted pavement, echoing louder than they should, while voices dissolved into the fog as if devoured by it. On that road, silence was broken only by the occasional hum of a passing car. But at 11:47, something else lingered in the air, an unease as though the night itself was holding its breath. The girl had been walking home. Witnesses later remembered a dark jacket, hair pulled up, the pale blur of her face as she moved quickly through the fog. She was only a few blocks from her house. The route was familiar, ordinary. Nothing about it should have been dangerous. And yet on that night, it became the last path she ever walked. Snow clung to the edges of the asphalt, the season's first hesitant dusting. In the morning, officers would crouch under the weak grey light of dawn and trace the faint outline of her footsteps pressed into that thin sheet of white. Each step neat, steady, until suddenly, nothing. The trail stopped as though she had stepped off the earth itself. No drag marks, no signs of a struggle, just an abrupt end, as if the fog had swallowed her whole. Her bag was later found at the side of the road, its strap torn slightly, the contents still inside. Wallet, a folded note from school, lip gloss capped tight. It didn't suggest robbery, it suggested interruption. A life paused mid-breath. Neighbors remembered waking to sirens that night. Red and blue lights pulsing against the fog, making shadows leap across clapboard houses and barns. Some peered through their curtains and swore they saw officers pacing the road with flashlights, beams cutting through the mist, but never landing on anything. Others remembered the dogs, howling as they pulled handlers toward the woods, only to lose the trail in the wet leaves and frozen ground. And in the hours that followed, her absence deepened into something far darker. Her bedroom light still glowed, her bed untouched, a half-finished cup of cocoa cooling on her desk. The ordinariness of it all clashed violently with the reality that the girl who should have been asleep inside that room was instead missing, her footprints ending in silence out on the road. By dawn, whispers rippled across town. How does someone vanish in the center of a quiet community, within earshot of homes, in a place where every face is familiar? As the sun rose pale and weak, investigators stood in the middle of that road, the fog finally lifting, revealing nothing. Just asphalt, snow, and the abrupt stop of a teenage girl's last steps. And the question that began that morning still haunts the story today. How could someone simply disappear in the middle of town, leaving behind no trace? Before she became a name on posters, before her disappearance froze the town in fear, she was simply a teenage girl living in small-town Michigan. 16 years old, restless, hopeful, caught between childhood and the edge of something bigger. Her name was spoken softly in her family's kitchen, with laughter that used to fill the house. She had been the youngest of 3 siblings, the one her mother still instinctively protected, though she protested against being treated as the baby of the family. Teachers remembered her intelligence, not the sharp, showy kind, but the quiet persistence of a student who cared. She loved art class most, where she could lose herself sketching faces in the margins of her notebooks. At home, she often wore the same faded denim jacket. Photos show her in it, standing in front of the high school gym, hair wind-blown, her smile wide, eyes bright with the kind of light that only exists before life hardens into routine. It is an image almost painful in retrospect, because that same face, captured by a disposable camera in the late summer of 2001, would be reprinted across the county only months later, taped to lampposts, stapled to telephone poles, begging for answers. She wasn't extraordinary in the way strangers might define it. And that, perhaps, was what made her so beloved. She dreamed small, attainable dreams. A part-time job at the corner diner, saving up for a used car, college in the future maybe, though she hadn't settled on what she wanted to study. Friends say she wanted to see more of the world beyond their quiet streets, but also carried a loyalty to her hometown that made her hesitate at the thought of leaving. Her family describes her laugh quick, contagious, the kind that bubbled up from deep in her chest. They remember her long phone calls late at night, curled in the corner of her bedroom with the cord stretched taut across the floor, whispering secrets about crushes, plans and frustrations. She was stubborn too. When her father told her to be home by 10, she negotiated for 11. When her mother warned her about walking alone, she insisted she wasn't a child anymore. It was the stubbornness of someone still testing boundaries, still believing nothing could truly go wrong. Her diary, later released by her family in fragments, revealed the simplicity of her world. Notes about her favorite songs on the radio, sketches of hearts in the margins, a line written only a week before she vanished: "I can't wait for winter. I love when the air feels sharp and clean." Those who loved her speak of her as though she might still walk through the door, as though she might laugh again in the kitchen, or roll her eyes at her siblings. But memory over the years has a way of becoming sharper and more fragile. What remains is a patchwork of images: her at the bus stop, in the diner booth with friends, helping her mother stir batter for pancakes on Sunday morning. Ordinary moments that gained unbearable weight the instant she was gone. No one in that small town could have imagined that her life, so familiar and unremarkable in its normalcy, would soon define 2 decades of grief. No one thought the denim jacket in those photographs would become iconic, frozen in time, the last proof of a girl who should have grown into a woman but never had the chance. Because the night she disappeared did not just mark the loss of one daughter, one sister, one friend. It marked the beginning of a story that would haunt every corner of her community. No one imagined that night would define the next 2 decades for her family and for the town itself. The hours leading to her disappearance unfolded like any ordinary Sunday evening in a small Midwestern town. Nothing seemed remarkable until hindsight turned every second into a haunting clue. October 14, 2001, 7:12 p.m. She was last seen at a friend's house on the north side of town, where she'd spent the evening watching movies. 2 girls lounging in sweatshirts, popcorn scattered across the couch cushions, the television flickering in the dim light. Nothing unusual. At one point she laughed so hard she spilled her soda, apologizing as she dabbed at the carpet with a napkin. Her friends later told police there was no sign of anything wrong, no fear, no hint of what was coming. 9:03 p.m. She called her mother, her voice casual. She promised she'd be home before midnight. It was the kind of conversation that happens 100 times between teenagers and their parents. Brief, unremarkable, a check-in, nothing more. 10:18 p.m. Neighbors remembered spotting her walking down Maple Street, her denim jacket buttoned up against the cold. The fog was already beginning to drift across the road, softening the edges of the streetlights. One man recalled how quickly her figure seemed to dissolve into the mist, as though the night was swallowing her whole. 11:01 p.m. A friend tried calling her cell phone. The ring echoed into silence. She never picked up. 11:19 p.m. A witness reported seeing her just 2 blocks from her house. She walked briskly, head down, hands tucked into her pockets. It was late, but this was her town, familiar, safe. At least it should have been. 11:47 p.m. The timeline ends. Somewhere between her last sighting and the moment she should have reached her front door, she vanished. Detectives later tried to stitch the fragments of that night into something coherent. The movie, the phone call, the walk. But what remained most chilling was not what people saw, it was the silence of what they didn't. No one heard a scream. No one reported a struggle. Cars passed on the main road, but drivers remembered nothing unusual, Her final phone call became an anchor point for investigators. The unanswered ring, the last attempt to reach her. In court years later, prosecutors would replay the voicemail, the hollow tone of a phone ringing into emptiness, followed by the mechanical voice, "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." That silence became a symbol of the night, an unanswered call that echoed louder with each passing hour. Her walk should have taken only 47 minutes from start to finish. Less than an hour, but in that narrow window of time, she disappeared completely. It wasn't enough time for her to willingly run away. It wasn't enough time to leave the county unnoticed. Something had happened in plain sight, hidden only by fog and darkness. Police scoured the route she should have taken. Flashlights swept across empty fields, through shallow ditches, along the tree line. Search dogs strained against their leashes, catching faint traces that evaporated near the road. Each clue dissolved into confusion, like the fog itself. For her family, the timeline became unbearable to revisit. The precise ticking of a clock that now defined the rest of their lives, every second accounted for, until the moment time seemed to stop. 47 minutes. That's all it took for her to vanish. 47 minutes to transform an ordinary Sunday night into a mystery that would torment investigators and devastate her loved ones for 20 long years. The first 24 hours after a disappearance are critical. Every investigator knows it. Every family clings to it. And in October of 2001, those hours unfolded with a frantic intensity that would leave the entire town reeling. By 1 a.m., police cruisers lined Maple Street, their red and blue lights cutting through the fog. Officers moved door to door, knocking, rousing neighbors from sleep. Porch lights flicked on, curtains twitched. "Have you seen her? Did you hear anything?" The answers were always the same. No, nothing, just silence. The scanner crackled with constant chatter. Unit 5 sweep the East Field. K9s en route. Parents at the station. The clipped voices betrayed something else beneath the surface, an urgency bordering on panic. Her family gathered at the police department, hollow-eyed, clinging to hope as the clock ticked past 2 a.m. Her mother sat with arms wrapped tightly around herself, rocking slightly, as though willing her daughter to walk through the door at any moment. Her father's voice was hoarse, as he repeated her description to officers again and again. Denim jacket, brown hair, green eyes, 5'5". His words blurred into the white noise of printers spitting out missing person flyers. By dawn, the search expanded. Volunteers joined the effort, fanning out across fields, combing through ditches, scanning abandoned barns and sheds. Helicopters circled overhead, their floodlights sweeping over rooftops, illuminating nothing but frost-coated grass and empty backyards. The local media arrived before sunrise. Reporters crowded behind yellow tape, their cameras fogging in the cold air, their microphones thrust toward officers who had no answers. Is there evidence of foul play? Has the family received any messages? The police chief stood at a podium, fatigue carved deep into his face. His words, broadcast across the county that morning, were measured, almost brittle. "We are treating this as a missing person. At this time we cannot confirm further details." Rumors bloomed faster than facts. At the high school, students whispered about strangers seen in parked cars, about white vans lurking near the park, about shadows in the woods. At diners and gas stations, the stories twisted with each retelling. Some swore she had run away. Others whispered she'd been taken. In a town where everyone knew each other's names, the unknown was suffocating. Detectives followed every lead, no matter how thin. A man walking his dog claimed he'd heard tires screeching near Maple Street. Officers canvassed the road, but found no skid marks, no debris, nothing. Another neighbor thought she saw a figure near the edge of the woods. When police searched, they found only deer tracks and broken branches. By the third day, exhaustion showed in every officer's face. Coffee cups stacked in the station, eyes bloodshot, notebooks filling with dead ends. A map of the town covered one wall, crisscrossed with pushpins and string marking the search radius. The circle grew wider by the hour, but the center remained hollow, no trace, no answers. And for her family, each press conference felt like a cruel performance. Reporters spoke of the missing girl as though she were already gone. Neighbors dropped off casseroles as though grief had already set in. Her siblings stood numb at the edge of candlelight vigils, watching classmates cry into their hands. The truth was already slipping away. The fog had cleared, but the mystery remained impenetrable. Despite hundreds of tips, dozens of interviews, and a community searching with desperate devotion, investigators were left with nothing but questions. The trail was growing cold. In the weeks that followed, the town of Ravenwood, Michigan, seemed to exhale in shallow, broken breaths. Life went on. Students filed into classrooms, farmers tended their fields, church bells rang on Sundays, but beneath it all was a current of unease that never loosened. Everywhere her absence was visible. Her photograph hung on bulletin boards in the high school hallways, taped beside announcements about football games and homecoming dances. At the grocery store, a stack of flyers sat by the register, faces of teenagers passing over them with distracted hands, before realizing they knew the girl staring back. And at night, candles flickered in windows, their flames small but defiant against the dark. The community rallied. Vigils were held in the town square, hundreds gathering in silence, clutching candles that dripped hot wax onto trembling hands. Songs of prayer rose into the crisp autumn air. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispers caught in their throats as they exchanged nervous glances. Fathers shook their heads and muttered promises that they would not let something like this happen again. But under every vow of solidarity, there was fear. At the local diner, conversations turned sharper, more suspicious. Plates of eggs grew cold as neighbors leaned across tables to share hushed theories. I heard she was seen getting into a car. The police must know more than they're saying. What if it was someone from right here? Forks clinked against ceramic, and eyes shifted subtly around the room, landing on familiar faces that suddenly seemed less familiar than before. The local newspaper ran headline after headline. Missing teen
Day 10, Town on Edge.
Grainy black and white photographs of her smile filled the front page, accompanied by columns speculating on the investigation. Each article seemed to offer hope, but ended with the same conclusion: still no answers. As days turned into weeks, paranoia seeped into daily routines. Parents no longer let their children walk to school. Porch lights burned all night long. Deadbolts clicked into place before dusk. The sound of a car door slamming late at night made curtains twitch, hearts quicken. Ravenwood had always prided itself on being safe, the kind of place where people left doors unlocked and bicycles leaned unattended against fences. Now that trust was fractured. Whispered theories circulated like wildfire. Some pointed to drifters who had passed through town. Others looked closer, toward familiar men who lingered too long at the bar, or reclusive neighbors whose windows stayed dark. For every candle-lit prayer, there was an undercurrent of accusation, a gnawing suspicion that the answer might be hiding in plain sight. Her family bore the brunt of both compassion and scrutiny. Friends left casseroles at their doorstep, but strangers stared too long at the grocery store, eyes heavy with questions unspoken. Her siblings were treated differently at school, some classmates offering pity, others avoiding them entirely. Grief set them apart, making them both visible and isolated. And always the community waited, for news, for resolution, for something to make sense of the fear that had settled like a shadow across every corner of town. But the weeks passed, and the silence deepened. The vigils grew smaller, candles sputtering out in the cold wind. Hope lingered, but it had dulled into something quieter, more desperate, because as each day slipped by without answers, one thought began to settle into the back of every mind in Ravenwood. What if the person responsible wasn't out there at all? What if they were here, among them, As the weeks turned into months, the investigation shifted from frantic urgency to grim endurance. For the detectives assigned to the case, it became more than a job. It became an obsession. Detective Mark Callahan still remembers the way the evidence box looked the first time he opened it. A stack of reports, Polaroid photographs of the road where her footsteps ended, a few personal belongings sealed in clear bags, the denim jacket, a school notebook with doodles in the margins, a photograph of her taped to the inside of the folder, a face meant to remind investigators what was at stake. From the beginning, he carried that box everywhere, as though answers might fall out if he stared long enough. Night after night, detectives pored over the same files, circling details in their notebooks until the pages tore from the pressure of their pens. Witness statements highlighted, cross-referenced, scribbled with frustration. Check alibi again, re-interview neighbor. Timeline doesn't add up. The notes filled dozens of legal pads, a physical record of their desperation. They tried everything, door-to-door canvasses, dozens of search warrants, hours of taped interviews in rooms where the clock ticked loudly against the silence of reluctant suspects, a polygraph machine humming in the corner as men sweated under its wires. Some lied, some told the truth, none gave them what they needed. The case consumed them. One detective missed his daughter's birthday party because a tip had come in that seemed too urgent to wait. Another confided to his partner that he dreamt of her face almost nightly, waking drenched in sweat, only to return to the station at dawn and sift through the same stagnant files. Cigarette smoke thickened the squad room, coffee cups gathered like monuments to their sleeplessness. Callahan was the one who voiced it out loud one night, when the weight of the case had bled into every part of his life. He stood alone in the evidence room, staring at the sealed bags, and whispered, "I'll find you," a promise to a girl he had never met, spoken into the silence of a fluorescent-lit room. But promises don't solve cases. The trail kept unraveling, each lead collapsing under scrutiny. Tips turned to rumors, rumors turned to noise, and as the years stretched forward, what had begun as an urgent manhunt hardened into something colder, heavier, the kind of case that haunted detectives not because of what they knew, but because of what they didn't. Some officers rotated off the case, burned out, their marriages strained, their health declining. Others stayed, unable to let go, their identities fused with the search for a girl who never came home. The obsession hollowed them, but also bound them together, a fraternity of failure, held by the weight of one missing teenager. Eventually, the evidence box was sealed, the lid closed, the label marked "Cold Case." It was placed on a metal shelf deep in the archives, indistinguishable from hundreds of others. Dust began to gather on its edges, but for Callahan, and for a handful of others, the box never truly closed. It lived in their minds, an unsolved riddle replayed on repeat. They couldn't walk down Maple Street without seeing her footprints vanish into nothing. They couldn't hear a phone ring unanswered without remembering the silence of that night. And so, though the world around them moved forward, the detectives remained chained to October 14, 2001, to the fog, to the road, to the girl who had vanished into thin air. The evidence box was shelved, yes, but the obsession never left. Cold cases are often defined not only by what investigators uncover, but by everything they chase that turns to ash in their hands. This case was no exception. In the years that followed her disappearance, suspects emerged one after another, each one stirring hope, each one unraveling into disappointment. There was the neighbor who lived just a block away, a man in his 40s with a history of minor offenses. He had been seen walking near Maple Street the night she vanished. Detectives brought him in for questioning, the tape recorder clicking on, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He denied everything. When the polygraph needle scribbled across the paper, the results suggested deception. For weeks he was the prime suspect, but then his alibi held. Security footage placed him miles away at the precise time she disappeared. The hope that they had finally found their answer collapsed in an instant. Then came the drifter. A man passing through Michigan on his way west, spotted hitchhiking near the highway. He had a criminal record, violent charges in another state, and a look in his eye that unsettled even seasoned detectives. They interrogated him for hours. He confessed flatly, chillingly. He claimed he had taken her, claimed he knew where her body was hidden. Search teams swarmed the site he described, digging through frozen soil, combing through brush. Nothing. He recanted days later, smirking as he admitted he'd lied for attention. A false confession, one of many that would plague the investigation. Another lead pointed to a local boy, barely 18, who had once dated one of her friends. His name surfaced repeatedly in whispers around the high school. He was interrogated, pressured, cornered, but nothing tied him to the disappearance. He became yet another name crossed off in the thick binders of case files. The false leads piled up. Anonymous tips poured in, strangers calling at midnight, claiming visions, psychics scribbling maps with shaking hands, neighbors reporting suspicious movements that proved to be nothing more than routine errands. Each one demanded attention. Each one drained resources, stole sleep, and ended in disappointment. Detectives began to question themselves. Were they missing something obvious? Had the truth been staring them in the face all along? Each dead end carried not only frustration, but shame. The community's eyes were on them, waiting, demanding answers they could not deliver. And through it all, the family watched from the sidelines, clinging to each new suspect with fragile hope, only to be shattered again and again. Each name that surfaced brought the possibility of closure. Each cleared suspect reopened the wound. Her mother once admitted, years later, that she sometimes prayed they would find anyone guilty, just so the nightmare would end. But the years marched on, and the leads dwindled. The false confessions faded. The suspects blurred together, faces in interrogation rooms that all ended the same way, with detectives walking out, shoulders heavy. Cold cases are often defined, not only by what investigators uncover, but by everything they chase that turns to ash in their hands. This case was no exception. In the years that followed her disappearance, suspects emerged one after another, each one stirring hope, each one unraveling into disappointment. There was the neighbor who lived just a block away, a man in his 40s with a history of minor offenses. He had been seen walking near Maple Street the night she vanished. Detectives brought him in for questioning, the tape recorder clicking on, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He denied everything. When the polygraph needles scribbled across the paper, the results suggested deception. For weeks he was the prime suspect, but then his alibi held. Security footage placed him miles away at the precise time she disappeared. The hope that they had finally found their answer collapsed in an instant. Then came the drifter. A man passing through Michigan on his way west, spotted hitchhiking near the highway. He had a criminal record, violent charges in another state, and a look in his eye that unsettled even seasoned detectives. They interrogated him for hours. He confessed flatly, chillingly. He claimed he had taken her, claimed he knew where her body was hidden. Search teams swarmed the site he described, digging through frozen soil, combing through brush. Nothing. He recanted days later, smirking as he admitted he'd lied for attention. A false confession, one of many that would plague the investigation. Another lead pointed to a local boy, barely 18, who had once dated one of her friends. His name surfaced repeatedly in whispers around the high school. He was interrogated, pressured, cornered, but nothing tied him to the disappearance. He became yet another name crossed off in the thick binders of case files. The false leads piled up. Anonymous tips poured in, strangers calling at midnight, claiming visions, psychics scribbling maps with shaking hands, neighbors reporting suspicious movements that proved to be nothing more than routine errands. Each one demanded attention. Each one drained resources, stole sleep, and ended in disappointment.
Detectives began to question themselves. Were they missing something obvious? Had the truth been staring them in the face all along? Each dead end carried not only frustration, but shame. The community's eyes were on them, waiting, demanding answers they could not deliver. And through it all, the family watched from the sidelines, clinging to each new suspect with fragile hope, only to be shattered again and again. Each name that surfaced brought the possibility of closure. Each cleared suspect reopened the wound. Her mother once admitted, years later, that she sometimes prayed they would find anyone guilty, just so the nightmare would end. But the years marched on, and the leads dwindled, the false confessions faded, the suspects blurred together, faces in interrogation rooms that all ended the same way, with detectives walking out, shoulders heavy, knowing they were no closer than before. For years the case gathered dust. Yet the truth was out there waiting, buried in silence. The noise of the investigation eventually faded. The headlines shrank. The vigils grew smaller, their flames fewer each year. And then, like so many unsolved cases, silence settled over Ravenwood.
By the 5th anniversary, her name appeared only in brief newspaper blurbs, a single column on page 6, family of missing teens still seeking answers. By the 10th, the case was mentioned only in retrospectives, lists of mysteries that haunted Michigan. What had once been urgent was now background noise, the static of a community learning to live with absence. For her family, time did not heal. It only hardened. Birthdays came and went, each marked with a cake no one had the heart to finish. Her siblings grew older, went off to college, started families of their own. Yet every Christmas, her stocking still hung by the fireplace. Every Thanksgiving, an empty chair waited at the table, a space both symbolic and unbearable. Her mother aged in those years more rapidly than she should have. Photographs show the progression, a hopeful face in the early days, pleading with reporters, a weary woman a decade later, eyes shadowed, smile absent. She spoke less about her daughter as the years dragged on, not because she had forgotten, but because words had become too heavy to carry. Her father threw himself into routine, rising at dawn, tending to chores, avoiding the silence of the house. At night he sometimes sat in the garage, staring at the walls where his daughter's bicycle still leaned, untouched, tires flat with dust. The community too changed under the weight of uncertainty. Parents still told their children not to walk home alone. Even years later, strangers were regarded with suspicion. For some, the case became a story to caution others, repeated with a shake of the head. Do you remember the girl who disappeared? For others, it was a wound best left unspoken. Detectives rotated, reassigned, retired. A few still thought of the case often, but officially, it sat untouched in the archives, cold, forgotten by everyone except those who had loved her. And yet, even in the silence, memory persisted. On anniversaries, her friends gathered quietly at the edge of Maple Street, laying flowers where her footprints had ended. They were adults now, with jobs and families, yet when they stood in that place, they became teenagers again, frozen in the autumn of 2001. Technology changed. DNA science advanced. Old evidence in other cases began yielding new answers. Families across the country learned the truth decades after loss, and so a faint ember of hope remained among those who knew her story. They whispered it on hard days, when grief seemed to close in. Maybe science will catch up. Maybe one day we'll finally know. Years of silence stretched endlessly, but silence is never absolute. In its stillness the past waits. Files gather dust, but evidence does not disappear. It lingers, patient, waiting for the right eyes, the right tools, the right moment. And in Ravenwood that moment was coming, because science was about to catch up with the past. For nearly 2 decades the box sat in storage, sealed, untouched. Its label, Cold Case 01457, gathering dust among rows of forgotten tragedies. But in 2019, the tide began to shift. It started quietly, with a new detective assigned to the cold case unit. Detective Sarah Whitaker was younger than those who had first worked the investigation, unburdened by the failures of the past, but determined to make the forgotten speak. She carried the box to her desk one autumn afternoon, the same season the girl had vanished. As she lifted the lid, she felt the weight of 20 years pressing down. Inside lay the same fragments that had haunted her predecessors: the jacket, the notebooks, the grainy photographs. But what stood out now was not what had been missed, it was what could be tested again. Science had changed. Whitaker submitted several items for reanalysis: fibers, hairs, trace materials, that earlier labs had dismissed as inconclusive. This time the technology was sharper, faster, more exact. Weeks passed in silence. Then came the call. A lab technician's voice on the other end of the line. "We've got something." The DNA profile was partial, degraded by time, but it was enough to generate a hit when cross-referenced against databases unavailable in 2001, enough to open the door that had been locked for so long. Whitaker paced her office that night, case files spread across her desk, her heart pounding with something the department hadn't felt in years: hope. She reviewed every page again, now with the possibility of an answer dangling just out of reach. Every witness statement, every rumor, every dead end suddenly took on new weight. Had the truth always been hiding here, obscured only by the limits of science? The official word came days later, delivered in a sterile lab report, with a name typed neatly across the page, a name that had slipped through 2 decades of suspicion and surveillance, a name that would shock the town when it was revealed. The moment was electric. Detectives who had nearly retired were called back into the loop, summoned into conference rooms where they had once sat defeated. Now maps were unfolded again, photographs spread across tables, evidence bags reopened. The hunt was alive once more. One officer later admitted the atmosphere was surreal. After years of silence, after years of funerals and anniversaries, and endless disappointment, there was suddenly noise again. Phones rang, voices rose, hope surged through the department like adrenaline. But hope carried caution. They had been misled before. False confessions, failed access, suspects who seemed guilty until they weren't. Whitaker tempered her excitement with discipline. Every step needed proof. Every lid needed to be airtight. Still, the shift was undeniable. After 20 years of dust and silence, the case had cracked open, and at the center of it was a single name, a name no one expected. The name on the lab report was ordinary, familiar, even. It wasn't the shadowy drifter or the strange neighbor whispered about for years. It was someone who had blended into the background of Ravenwood all along. His name, Daniel Reeves. At the time of the disappearance, Reeves had been 31 years old, a local mechanic, known for his quiet demeanor and steady work at the garage on Main Street. Customers remembered him as polite, reserved, the kind of man who fixed your car without small talk, who nodded politely when thanked, but rarely smiled. For 2 decades he had remained invisible in plain sight. Married briefly, divorced quietly, no children. He lived alone in a modest house just outside town, the kind of place people drove past without notice. He drank at the bar sometimes, sat alone at a corner stool, never caused trouble. He had been interviewed briefly in 2001, along with dozens of other men in the area, and dismissed. Nothing had tied him directly to the crime, nothing until the DNA. Detectives revisited his file, flipping through pages that now seemed laced with hidden menace. In the original reports, his name barely appeared, a footnote among hundreds of interviews. He had claimed he was home the night she vanished, watching television alone, with no evidence to the contrary. His statement had been accepted and filed away. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, almost forgettable. He kept to himself. One woman said, her voice trembling when she learned his name, "I never thought twice about him." Another neighbor recalled seeing him mow his lawn every Sunday, head down, methodical, the picture of routine. But when detectives dug deeper, cracks appeared. A history of violence charges in his early 20s, bar fights, an assault that had been pled down, records buried beneath years of good behavior, a job history marked by sudden shifts, moving from one garage to another, and then most chillingly, his proximity. His house sat less than a mile from the road where her footprints ended. The revelation rippled through Ravenwood like a shockwave. People who had once nodded to him at the gas station now spoke in hushed tones of unease. Parents shuddered at the thought that for all these years, the man responsible had been living among them, unnoticed, undisturbed. Detectives prepared carefully. They could not afford mistakes. Surveillance was set up, Reeves' routines observed. He still lived alone, still worked on cars in his garage, still carried himself with the same quiet anonymity that had shielded him for years. But now, behind that anonymity, investigators saw something else. A predator who had walked freely for 2 decades. A man who had gone to the grocery store, filled his tank at the same pumps, stood in line at the same diner, all while the town mourned the girl he had taken. And so, after 20 years of silence, there came a knock at his door. Detectives stood on his porch, badges out, their hearts pounding with the weight of history. Inside, Reeves appeared calm, almost bemused. He invited them in, his expression betraying nothing. But the evidence was no longer a question. Science had spoken. The suspect had been revealed. The air was heavy the morning of the arrest. A grey sky hung over Ravenwood, the same muted tones that had blanketed the night of her disappearance. This time, however, the silence would not protect Daniel Reeves. Detectives moved with precision. Patrol cars staged quietly down the street, engines idling. Officers checked their radios, hearts racing as they prepared to take down the man who had haunted their case files for 2 decades. The order was given. When Reeves stepped out of his house, carrying a coffee mug toward the porch, he found himself surrounded. Voices rang out, firm and unyielding. "Daniel Reeves, you are under arrest." He froze, mug trembling in his hand before it slipped and shattered on the concrete. In that instant, his mask cracked. The calm, unremarkable mechanic was gone, replaced by a man whose secrets had finally been cornered. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the metallic sound sharp and final. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some gasping, some whispering in disbelief. Few had suspected him, yet now they watched as their quiet neighbor was led away, flanked by detectives who had waited 20 years for this walk. Inside the interrogation room, Reeves sat expressionless at first. The detectives laid out the evidence, the DNA match, the fibers, the timeline reconstructed with forensic precision. For hours, he resisted, maintaining fragments of denial, offering vague shrugs and empty words. But the walls closed in. Every question brought him closer to the truth. Every photograph placed in front of him chipped away at the silence he had maintained. And then finally his shoulders slumped. His words came out low, almost inaudible at first. "Yes, I did it." The confession spilled out in halting sentences. He described seeing her walking that night, the impulse that led him to stop, the violence that followed. Details matched what investigators had long suspected, but could never prove. The weight of his admission hung in the room like smoke, suffocating in its finality. The trial came months later, held in a packed courthouse, where the victim's face once more filled newspapers and television screens. Family members sat in the front row, clutching each other's hands as Reeves was brought in, shackles clinking with each step. Prosecutors laid out the case meticulously, piecing together the forensic evidence, the confession, the timeline of events. Witnesses testified, experts explained the science that had finally unlocked the mystery. Reeves himself remained largely silent, his gaze fixed downward, avoiding the stares of the jury and the family he had shattered. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder, the room exhaled. Tears flowed, sobs echoed. The victim's mother wept openly, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter. For the first time in 2 decades, the family had answers, yet answers came at a price. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked the question that lingered over every solved cold case: was justice enough? Could a conviction, no matter how decisive, truly fill the void of 20 years? Detective Whitaker, who had revived the case, offered only this: Justice doesn't erase grief, but it means she's no longer lost in silence. Riggs was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, shackled and diminished, the community finally saw the face of the man who had lived among them, hiding in plain sight. But for the family, one question remained, heavier than all the rest: can justice ever truly heal 20 years of silence? The verdict had been read. The man responsible was behind bars. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Ravenwood exhaled. But peace did not arrive with the gavel's strike. In the weeks following Daniel Reeves' conviction, the town found itself haunted by dual realities. On one hand, there was relief, the knowledge that the monster who had lived quietly among them was gone. On the other, there was unease. How could they have missed him? How could the ordinary man at the gas pump, the mechanic fixing their cars, have been capable of such violence? The betrayal of normalcy cut deep. For the victim's family, the end of the trial brought no end to grief. Her mother, now aged and frail, sat at the gravesite, finally able to place flowers not on a memorial, but on the earth where her daughter had been laid to rest. "We found you," she whispered through tears, though the words carried no triumph. Her father, stoic as ever, stood beside her in silence, the weight of 2 decades etched into every line of his face. Her siblings spoke of her often in the months that followed, determined to keep her alive in stories, rather than in absence. At family gatherings, they shared memories of her laughter, her stubbornness, her dreams of leaving their small town for something bigger. Yet the empty chair at the table remained. No conviction could ever fill that space. The community, too, sought healing. Vigils transformed into memorials, no longer fueled by questions but by remembrance. Candles flickered outside the old church. Photographs were displayed at the library, and townspeople spoke of her in reverent tones. At the high school, a scholarship was created in her name, an effort to ensure that her story would be carried forward, not as a tragedy alone, but as a legacy. Detective Whitaker retired a few years later, her work on the case having defined her career. At her farewell gathering, she admitted the truth. The victory was bittersweet. Solving the case had brought closure, yes, but closure was not the same as healing. Justice is measured in facts, she told a small crowd, but grief is measured in years, and grief does not vanish with a verdict. The house where Reeves once lived now sits empty, windows dark, grass overgrown. Locals avoid driving past it, as if the ground itself still remembers. It stands as a reminder of the danger that once went unseen, a quiet scar on the landscape of Ravenwood. And yet life has continued. Children play on the sidewalks again. Laughter rings out at the diner where whispers once reigned. The town carries its history, but it no longer suffocates under it. The case remains a lesson, retold by detectives and journalists, professors and parents, a reminder of how long shadows can linger, and how silence does not mean absence. For 2 decades, the truth lay buried in a file box, waiting for the day science and persistence would pry it open. In the end, Michigan finally had answers, but answers don't erase absence. They only remind us how long the shadows of the past can linger.